Let's talk about exceptions and exception handling. Well, first, what is an exception? An exception is a runtime error that happens when you run your program and an error occurs because something within your program didn't occur correctly. Maybe you're out of memory, maybe you're dividing by 0, maybe you're expecting an integer and somebody gives you a character, for example. Things that occur, there can be many different types, many different reasons for exceptions, and the way that you work with exceptions are that you handle them. You make sure that if an error occurs, you can gracefully handle it within your application. We'll take a look at that, and that's using try-catch. That's a way that we can actually catch our exceptions. Here we just have an example. I'll show you what happens when you get an exception that maybe you weren't expecting, but if you don't properly trap for example, this is expecting a number via a write line from a console application. We're expecting a number. We don't check to make sure that our value via the console.readme, this is where the user can input. When the user inputs a character or a decimal place number that's not an integer, for example, this is going to give us an exception or raise an exception here because we can't parse something that's not an integer. Even though it's a string, it's going to try to parse it into an integer using the int.parse method, which is a great way to get a string into our integer base. We know that ints have a range that doesn't include decimal place numbers, and for this example, we'll just debug. We're going to do a start without debugging, which is normal for us. Enter a number. Well, we entered a number, but it has a decimal place. It's not an integer. So this is what we get. The application has generated an exception that couldn't be handled. So it gives you the process ID and the thread ID. You're probably going to see this a lot. We're not going to debug because we have it currently open, but we can hit OK. And this is going to let us know that we have an unhandled exception, system.formatException. The input string was not in a correct format. Well, that's pretty understandable. And this is where it's at, system.number.parseInt32. So this is where it winds up, system.int32.parse. This is what we're doing. And it gives you a lot of information about the errors that you have there. So we can just close that. And we'll do it another way. We'll do it with debugging. So we'd start, enter a number. We're actually reading from the input from the keyboard. Now it's opening up some debugging information here, and you can see that it's unhandled in our MS Core library.dll, because this is where we handle all the type details. And you can see that if we had additional information here to give, if we had our own exceptions, this is what it's going to give back as additional information. It's the message. The input string was not in the correct format, so it looks the same. We can continue or we can break. Normally you're going to break when you get an error like that, and you can see this is letting us know where it is, just like that. And you can see that this is where our problem lies. So we need to correct that. I'll show you how to do that in the try-catch exercise. But this is just to go over exceptions. Exceptions can happen, and they do quite often. Within the exceptions dialog box here, you can see that there are common language runtime exceptions, a lot to go through. Just like we would browse to the object browser, we can see system.exception down here, and all different kinds that we can actually work with. Arithmetic problems that we might have, and you can see that there are plenty. So you need to get familiar, depending on what you're doing, what your responsibility are. You might only have a little section of things that you need to work on. You don't necessarily work on everything. Within I/O, perhaps, within database, within the .NET, when you're dealing with sockets and things like that. So your particular area of expertise, you want to get familiar with as many of those. You want to get familiar with as many of those as you can, but it often happens that you find these exceptions through your programming and you trap for them when you need to. But you really need to get intense into the exception handling if you want to release a commercial application or something that's going to be released even within an intranet, within an enterprise operation. So that's how you can look through it. You can additionally go through and see that we can just get rid of some of these things down here just to take a peek. And you can see that within the system.exception, within the MS Core library, as usual, we have a bunch of different things that we can work with as far as the methods of our exception class. You can get the help link. If you have an additional help link, you can get or set this in your programming if you want to actually give a link to a help file that can help resolve that particular error that's coming up. You can actually get the message itself. You can also get or set the name of the application or the object actually that is causing this particular error to occur. There are also a few ways to call via the constructors, different ways you can actually create your own exceptions or create your own exception objects as you need to. So this is just more advanced information just to let you know that this is how you can get through there. We're going to actually correct this using the try-catch method.